In 1876, Francis Edgar Stanley improved the atomizer. He and his brother also made the Stanley steamer. In 1879, Abner Peeler invented the modern airbrush. An airbrush is perfect for scale models and art projects. You need an airbrush. There are two types of airbrush. Press the trigger, a single action, air pushes out paint. The amount of paint is controlled at the tail. Pro, easy to use. Con, you have to stop to adjust paint. Press the trigger, air flows. Pull back, paint flows. Two actions. The more you pull, the more paint flows. Pro, superb instant control. Con, more complicated. A paint bottle hangs under. Siphon action sucks out paint. Pro, holds a lot of paint. Con, needs a lot of paint. The paint sits in a small cup on the top or the side, and gravity pulls the paint. Pro, doesn't need much paint. Con, doesn't hold much paint. There's an external mix too. Double action sounded scary, like doing gymnastics and fine art at the same time. Gravity feed looked sloppy, but most people don't have a problem. A needle lets out paint. Many airbrushes have a 0.5mm needle. This is good for most jobs. Some brushes have a smaller needle for fine detail, like 0.4, 0.35, 0.3, 0.2, 0.18, and even 0.1mm. Some brushes let you change needle size. Most modelers and artists prefer a double-action, gravity-feed brush for control. Your first airbrush. There are two schools of thought. If it ain't got paint on it, paint it! Learn on the tool you will actually use. Much like the Ouija warriors of Loxelwit Island, who must make their own spear from a sapling they plant as an infant. It doesn't matter what you use. Just practice, practice, practice. That said, a double-action gravity feed is best. Your airbrush journey will be your own, with research and learning. But here are some very popular suggestions. A $20 airbrush will still work. If you don't have an air compressor, you can use canned air. But Propel is a limited quantity of air. There is no regulator, and it gets cold, which means sputtering. 4 to 6 cans and you've paid for an entry-level compressor. So really, you need an air compressor. Current prices start at US $100 or about 90 to 150 euros. There are two basic types of compressor. A small hobby compressor, made for an airbrush. They are compact and often very quiet. Or you can get a home workshop compressor. You can buy a regulator if it doesn't come with one, eBay, an airbrush, hobby, or hardware store. When finished, drain the tank. Compressed air has lots of water in it and can rust a tank. Water can also ruin a paint job. You can add a moisture trap to the compressor or put a small inline unit on the airbrush itself. Some regulators are also moisture traps. You can get a micro air control valve, or MAC valve. It's a small valve to dial down air, good for fine lines and stippling. eBay, an airbrush, or hobby store. Most painting happens at 15 to 30 psi, pounds per square inch, or 103 to 206 kPa, kilopascals. Get a quick connect. You can get big quick connects for regular air tools too. Hey man, check out my groovy threads. You'll need to know about air plumbing and fittings. There's BSP, NPT, PCL, Parallel, Tapered, JIC, Arrow, Industrial, Automotive, V-Style, Lincoln, Ball and Sleeve, Push to Connect, Cam Lock, Lure Lock, Twister Bayonet, Triflate and Euro. Every country in the world, 195, is officially metric. except for Liberia, Myanmar, and the United States, although NASA has used metric since Apollo. Air plumbing is still an imperial. Most airbrushes use a 1/8 inch connection. Badger and Pasha each have their own size, but you can easily get adapters. Compressor fittings are a 1/4 inch, but they're actually a 1/2 inch in size. The size means airflow, not fitting size. Most of the world uses compressors with BSP or British Standard Pipe Thread. The US uses NPT or National Pipe Taper Thread. There are adapters for airbrushes at hobby and hardware stores, but it's very important to check with a professional before you buy fittings. I used to think acrylic paint was kami crap. If it didn't give you a headache, it wasn't real paint. But I hardly ever used my airbrush. Then I really discovered acrylics. Water-based acrylic paint was invented in 1934 in Germany and only became popular in the 1950s. It's been high quality in the model world for over 30 years. Some acrylic paints, like Vallejo, are airbrush ready, pre-thinned. There has never been a better time to paint. Note: all solvents are at least slightly toxic, and just for fun cause headaches, dizziness, and nausea. Some are also carcinogenic. Take precautions. For solvent/enamel paint, thin with mineral turpentine, also called mineral spirits or white spirits. It's made from petroleum and different to plain turpentine, which is made from pine trees. Plain turpentine overspeeds paint drying and causes airbrush issues. Paint thinner. Almost any solvent can be called paint thinner. Often it contains mineral turpentine or alcohol. Acetone is very intense and can harm airbrush seals. Lacquer thinner is made from cellulose and often mixed with acetone. It's generally easier to find and cheaper than plain acetone. MEK, or methyl ethyl ketone. For practical purposes, it's like acetone, but nuclear. There are many solvents, but just get mineral turpentine. Tamiya acrylic is alcohol-based. You can clean with water, but it's best to thin with Tamiya X20A thinner. Do not mix Tamiya with water-based paint, or use X20A thinner in water-based paint. The paint turns to goo. When dry, you can paint over Tamiya with water paint. Many acrylic paints are non-toxic. Vallejo has been cadmium-free for over 10 years. If you use acrylic paint, you should use the thinner recommended for your paint brand. Each brand has a different formulation, and you may get bizarre results if you mix. There are homemade recipes for making your own thinner. For most acrylic paints, you can actually use dihydrogen monoxide as a thinner. Dihydrogen monoxide is widely available, and you can even drink it. That's right, H2O, or plain water. Well, not plain, but distilled. Distilling the water removes minerals and pollutants. Filtered water works too. Water can overdilute paint and ruin adhesion, but a few drops up to 30% works fine. Some homemade recipes include window cleaner or domestic cleaner. This is because both often contain some form of alcohol and glycol. Alcohol is a paint thinner, and glycol slows tip drying and clogging. But it's much easier and way cheaper to just buy alcohol in bulk, either IPA or denatured/methylated spirits, and glycerin, both available in the supermarket. Window cleaner often has ammonia. Ammonia is bad for brass and chrome and may eat airbrush seals. Some people add acrylic binder or airbrush retarder to their thinner recipe, but at that point you might as well just buy proper airbrush thinner. Primer. Yes, you should prime. A primer smooths the surface, helps paint bite, gives an even, non-reflective base for better color. There are two types: solvent-based, water-based. Solvent primers provide a good foundation, but they're toxic, smelly, and a pain to clean. Tamiya Rattle Can Primer looks and feels like it was airbrushed, but it's expensive. Other good solvent primers: Badger Stynylrez is smooth and lovely. Badger recommends a 0.5mm needle and high pressure. about 30 psi or 206 kPa. Users say a 0.35 needle also works. You must clean your airbrush right away. Automotive primer is thick and can obscure detail. Vallejo paint is highly regarded, but the primer peels and chips. Use a photo light box as a cheap spray booth. They are less than US $10 on eBay. You can stir paint with a motorized mixer. They look like a milk frother, but instead of a spring to pull in air, they have a solid end to stir. Or you can use a vortex mixer. They are made for test tubes, but fit a paint bottle. You can find one for US $30 to $50. Both work well. You can mix paint in the airbrush cup, block the nozzle and spray. Back pressure mixes the paint. Harder and Steenbeck say put the thinner in first so the guts won't clog. The best way to mix is in a separate cup. It doesn't mess up the airbrush and you have more control. There are many great videos on technique, but start by learning trigger control. Here are a few common airbrush problems. A dry tip will block paint. Clean the tip and increase pressure. Or thin your paint more. You can also add retarder to slow down drying. Paint can hit a bent tip and sputter. Replace the needle. International Scale Modeler has a handy technique to repair. Link below. The paint is too thin or the pressure too high. Add paint and/or lower pressure. You might have water in your air. An orange peel effect is a sign of water. Empty the moisture trap. In a double action, paint sprays when you push down for air. The needle may not be forward enough. Unlock the needle, push it forward till it is snug. Warning: the needle is very fragile. I accidentally looked at my needle once, and it bent. Listen up, maggots!
Yes, sir! This is my airbrush.
Without me, my airbrush is useless.
Without my airbrush, I am useless.
You will strip your airbrush to a collection of parts.
Take your airbrush apart and put it back together. Use a towel so parts don't roll away. Know your airbrush. Pour out the bowl and wipe it. Run water, cleaner, thinner, or solvent until the brush sprays clear. You can also use a cleaning jar. Take off the nozzle. The free wrench works, but holding the nozzle is very fiddly. Use an airbrush nozzle wrench. It holds the nozzle for you as you start threading. Clean the nozzle and needle cap with a dental pick from the supermarket. They are soft and come in different sizes. The wire cleaning brush sets are good for the rest of the brush. Push the needle out forward to keep the guts clean. For stubborn, dried paint, use an ultrasonic cleaner. Make sure you use a plastic container and keep all the parts away from each other so they don't knock and scrape. Dry everything and reassemble. Lube can help stop tip dry. Wipe the threaded parts in beeswax or petroleum jelly for a tight seal. Test the airbrush with water. If you have sputter or pulsating spray, add more lube or beeswax and retighten seals. If you need to put your airbrush aside for a bit, put water or thinner in a cup to sit the nose in. Remember to spray some scrap before painting again.
Now go and airbrush.